My sister dragged our mother across a bank parking lot and took every dollar she had saved for 20 years. But that wasn't the part that shattered me. The part that broke me was realizing my mother believed she was saving me when she handed over that money. How could a daughter twist love into something that dangerous? And how did I fail to see it before it was too late? My name is Heidi. I'm 32 years old, and I work as an accountant in Birmingham. Numbers have always been my safe place. They are predictable, balanced, honest. If something doesn't add up, there's a reason. And if you look long enough, you'll find it. People, on the other hand, are rarely that straightforward. I'm telling you this story because sometimes the biggest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who share your last name. And sometimes the truth is hiding in plain sight, quietly waiting for someone who knows how to read the signs. The day we buried my mother, it started raining, just as the final prayer ended. The sudden downpour soaked the white lilies resting on her fresh grave. I remember standing there in silence, watching the petals bend under the weight of the water, thinking how unfair it was that something so beautiful could collapse so easily. I didn't cry, not at first. I think part of me was still in shock. My older sister, Gretchen, stood a few feet away from me, looking entirely out of place in her tailored black designer coat and high-heeled boots that sank into the mud. Even at a funeral, she managed to look like she was attending a business meeting. She kept checking the time on her gold watch, not discreetly, impatiently. Every few minutes, her wrist would lift, her eyes would narrow slightly, and she would sigh as if the pastor's words were delaying something more important. I noticed everything. I always do. I told myself she was grieving differently. People process loss in strange ways, but something about her posture, the tightness in her jaw, the way she barely glanced at the casket, it didn't feel like grief. It felt like waiting. And that feeling stayed with me long after the mourners began walking back to their cars. For as long as I can remember, my mother had a ritual. Every single Friday morning, without fail, she would drive her old pickup truck to the same local bank. Rain or shine, holidays or not, she never let anything interrupt that routine. As a child, I thought it was charming. As an adult, I assumed it was responsible. She told me once, smiling softly, "A little discipline today means less fear tomorrow." I never questioned her. I trusted that she was building a safety net for herself, maybe even for us. But the last month of her life changed everything. Out of nowhere, Gretchen reappeared. For nearly 20 years, she had been mostly absent. She moved out early, chased promotions across state lines, climbed corporate ladders with relentless focus. Holidays were optional for her. Phone calls were rare. Visits were almost non-existent. And then suddenly, she was home every day, cooking meals, scheduling doctor's appointments, insisting on managing mother's medications. At first, I felt relieved. I thought maybe something had softened in her. Maybe success had finally made her secure enough to reconnect with us. But the more time she spent in the house, the more something felt wrong. I would walk into the living room and see my mother sitting stiffly on the couch while Gretchen stood behind her, one hand resting on her shoulder. Not gently, not affectionately. Possessively, my mother's smile would flicker when she saw me. Too quickly, like she was trying to reassure me before I even asked a question. There were small things I tried to ignore. The way my mother would lower her voice when Gretchen entered the room. The way she stopped mentioning her Friday bank trips. The way her hands trembled slightly when signing paperwork Gretchen placed in front of her. Once, I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and caught them mid-conversation. Gretchen was speaking in a low, urgent tone. My mother looked pale. When they noticed me, the conversation stopped instantly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Of course," Gretchen replied before my mother could answer. That was the first time I felt something cold settle in my stomach, but I pushed it away. Because it's easier to doubt yourself than to accuse your own sister of something sinister. The night before my mother passed, she asked me to sit with her. Her breathing was shallow, her voice weaker than I had ever heard it. "Heidi," she said quietly, "no matter what happens, you must promise me you'll be strong." I laughed softly, brushing her hair away from her forehead. "Mom, nothing's happening. But she didn't laugh back. There was something in her eyes, something heavy, almost apologetic. I thought she was afraid of dying. Now I know she was afraid of something else. When she passed away a few days later, the doctors said it was her heart. Complications, age, natural causes, but grief has a strange way of sharpening certain memories while blurring others. And as I stood there at her graveside, watching my sister glance at her watch again, I couldn't stop thinking about Fridays. 20 years of deposits, every single week, disciplined, methodical, faithful. My mother wasn't careless with money. She wasn't impulsive. She didn't make drastic financial decisions without reason. So why, in her final month, did she suddenly stop going to the bank? Why did she look terrified whenever Gretchen stood too close? And why did my sister seem less like a grieving daughter and more like someone waiting for paperwork to clear? The rain grew heavier, soaking through my coat, but I barely noticed. Because somewhere between the sound of the pastor's closing words and the sight of Gretchen's impatient expression, something inside me shifted. I didn't know the details yet. I didn't know about the withdrawal. I didn't know about the security footage. I didn't know about the lie that had been building for over a year. But I knew this. My instincts were screaming, and instincts, unlike people, don't lie. As the last car left the cemetery gates and Gretchen turned toward me with a tight, businesslike smile, I realized something else. This wasn't the end of my mother's story. It was the beginning of the truth, and I was going to follow the numbers wherever they led. By the time we returned to my mother's house after the funeral, the rain had stopped, but the air inside felt heavier than the storm we had just walked through. The house had always been small, modest, warm, in a quiet way. The kind of place where the floors creaked familiarly and the curtains carried the faint scent of laundry detergent and sunlight. But that afternoon, as soon as the door closed behind us, something shifted. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Gretchen didn't even take off her heels before she began. She tossed her designer coat over the back of the worn beige sofa, glanced around the living room with visible disdain, and said, "We need to settle the estate as soon as possible." No pause. No acknowledgement of the framed photo of our mother on the side table. No moment to breathe. I stood there, holding the casserole dish Mrs. Peterson from next door had forced into my hands, still dressed in black, still carrying the weight of fresh grief. "We just got back," I said quietly. "Can we not do this today?" She exhaled sharply, as if I were the unreasonable one. "Heidi, this isn't about feelings. This is about logistics. The market is strong right now. We need to list the house immediately." Immediately. The word echoed in my mind. She paced across the living room, stepping carefully around the braided rug our mother had owned for decades, as if it were an obstacle instead of a memory. "The property value has appreciated significantly," she continued, her tone slipping into the same polished cadence she used during corporate presentations. "If we wait, we risk depreciation. That would be financially irresponsible." Financially irresponsible. I almost laughed at the irony. "This isn't just a property," I said, setting the casserole down on the kitchen counter. "It's our home." She stopped pacing and looked at me as if I'd just spoken in another language. "It was her home," she corrected. "Now it's an asset." An asset. That was when I felt something inside me harden. I had spent my entire adult life working with numbers. I understood valuation, liquidity, return on investment, but there are things you don't reduce to line items on a spreadsheet. The scratch on the hallway wall from when we raced toy cars, the pencil marks inside the pantry door measuring our height each birthday, the faint indentation on the carpet where Dad's armchair used to sit before he passed. You can't calculate those. "I'm not selling," I said firmly. "Not right now." Her jaw tightened. "You don't get to make that decision alone." "I'm not," I replied. "I'm asking for time." But Gretchen wasn't interested in time. She was interested in speed. She began listing numbers out loud: estimated listing price, potential profit after taxes, division of proceeds. She spoke with cold precision, as if she were reciting quarterly earnings. There was no tremor in her voice, no grief, just urgency. "I have an investment opportunity that requires immediate capital," she added, almost casually. Delays could cost me 6 figures. 6 figure. I stared at her. This was the same woman who arrived at the funeral in a luxury car she had bragged about buying months earlier. The same woman wearing a watch that probably cost more than our mother's entire kitchen renovation. And yet she needed money urgently? Something didn't add up. "Why are you in such a rush?" I asked, studying her face. Her eyes flickered just for a second. Then the mask returned. "Because I don't have time to babysit a deteriorating property while you sort through your emotions." Babysit. Deteriorating. Each word felt deliberate, sharp enough to wound. "She's barely in the ground," I said quietly, my voice trembling despite my effort to steady it. "And you're already trying to erase her." That was when her patience cracked. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she snapped. "Sentimentality doesn't pay bills. We split the proceeds and move on. That's the mature thing to do." Mature. The word lingered between us like a challenge. "I'm not signing anything today," I said, meeting her gaze. Her eyes turned cold. "You have 1 week. After that, I'll have my attorney initiate a forced sale. I'm entitled to my share." There it was. Not grief, not sadness. Entitlement. She grabbed her purse from the table and stormed toward the door. Just before stepping outside, she turned back. "You've always been emotional, Heidi. That's your weakness." The door slammed behind her, and the house fell into a silence so thick it felt almost physical. I locked the door and leaned my forehead against it for a moment, trying to slow my breathing. Emotional. Maybe I was, but I also knew patterns. And urgency like that desperation masked as strategy usually meant one thing: pressure. I walked slowly through the house after she left, touching the back of chairs, running my fingers along the kitchen counter, absorbing the stillness. It felt wrong to make decisions in this state. Everything was too raw, but sleep wasn't coming that night. I could feel it. Around midnight, I found myself standing in my mother's bedroom doorway. The lamp beside her bed cast a soft yellow glow across the quilt she had sewn years ago. Her reading glasses still rested on the nightstand. I told myself I was just looking for clarity. Maybe there was paperwork explaining why Gretchen felt entitled to move so quickly. Maybe there was something I had missed. I began opening drawers carefully, almost apologetically, as if I were intruding. Utility bills, medical receipts, insurance statements, everything neatly stacked, categorized. My mother had always been organized in her own quiet way. Nothing unusual, but the unease in my chest wouldn't fade. I knelt beside her dresser and slowly removed the bottom drawer. My fingers traced along the wooden interior, pressing gently against the lining. That was when I felt it. A slight resistance beneath the floral paper at the base. I peeled it back carefully, and there it was, a small red notebook tucked flat against the wood, hidden deliberately. My heart began to pound. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Page after page, the same word written in careful handwriting. Deposit. Every Friday. Every week. For 20 years. The amounts were modest, but consistent, steady, faithful. My throat tightened. She had been building something, protecting something. Then I turned to the final page. One entry. Withdrawal entire balance. Dated 4 weeks before her death. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. Nothing like the neat script that filled the previous pages. The account had been emptied, completely. I stared at the number, trying to reconcile it in my mind. It wasn't a small amount. It was everything she had saved for 2 decades. Why would she do that? My mother didn't make impulsive financial decisions. She wasn't reckless. She didn't gamble. She didn't splurge. Unless she was afraid. A memory surfaced, uninvited, the way her hands trembled recently when signing documents Gretchen placed in front of her. The way she avoided my eyes when I asked about her bank trips. The way she seemed smaller in her own house. Suddenly, Gretchen's urgency about selling the property felt different. Not strategic. Panicked. I closed the notebook slowly and held it against my chest. If the money was gone, where did it go? And why did my sister act as if she needed cash immediately when she was already living a life of visible luxury? As an accountant, I had learned one universal truth. When numbers disappear, someone moved them. and I had a feeling I was about to find out who. The following Friday, at exactly 9 in the morning, the same time my mother had walked into that bank every week for 20 years, I pushed open the glass doors of the local branch with her red notebook clutched tightly in my bag. The air inside smelled faintly of printer ink and polished floors. It was quiet, orderly, predictable, the kind of place my mother trusted. I didn't stand in line. I walked straight to the receptionist's desk and said, as calmly as I could, "My name is Heidi Clara Thompson. I'm the executor of my mother's estate. I need to speak with the branch manager immediately." The young woman looked startled by the firmness in my voice, but something in my expression must have convinced her I wasn't there to make a routine inquiry. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly for a moment, then gestured toward a glass office in the back. Mrs. Henderson was exactly how I remembered her from years ago, neatly dressed, composed, glasses perched low on her nose. She stood when I entered. "Heidi, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said gently. "Thank you," I replied, taking a seat across from her desk. I wish this were a social visit. I placed the executor documents and the red notebook in front of her. My fingers felt steady, but inside, my thoughts were racing. "There was a full withdrawal from my mother's savings account 4 weeks before her death," I said. "I need to understand exactly what happened that day." Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted, subtle but noticeable, a flicker of recognition. She adjusted her glasses and began typing on her computer. The soft clicking of the keyboard filled the silence between us. I watched the screen reflect faintly in her lenses. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Your mother was one of our most consistent clients. 20 years without a missed deposit. Very disciplined." "I know," I said quietly. The transaction history appeared on her monitor, long columns of weekly credits stretching back year after year, a pattern of devotion, stability, then the final entry. Withdrawal. Entire balance. My chest tightened. "She had sole authority on the account?" I asked. "Yes," Mrs. Henderson confirmed. "There were no additional authorized signatories." That detail both relieved and unsettled me. Legally, no one else could touch the money. But that didn't mean she wasn't pressured. I leaned forward slightly. "What was her condition that day?" Mrs. Henderson hesitated. Not a long pause, but long enough. "She seemed different," she admitted carefully. "Agitated. She was sweating despite the air conditioning. Her hands were shaking when she signed the slip." My stomach dropped. That wasn't normal for her, was it? "No," she said softly. "She was usually very composed." I swallowed. "Was she alone?" Another pause. "No." The word landed like a stone. "There was another woman with her," Mrs. Henderson continued, standing very close behind her the entire time. "Can you describe her?" She was wearing large, dark sunglasses, even inside, tall, well-dressed. She glanced at me apologetically. "She kept her hand on your mother's shoulder." On her shoulder, not beside her. Not supportive. Controlling. "Did she speak?" I asked. "No. She didn't need to." The dynamic was clear. The room felt smaller. "Did anyone ask my mother if she was okay?" My voice sounded steady, but I could feel something sharp building beneath it. "I did," Mrs. Henderson said, lowering her eyes. "I asked if she was comfortable with the withdrawal. She shook her head slightly, but then she pushed the slip toward me and said she needed the funds urgently." "She shook her head?" I repeated. She was trembling. I wasn't sure if it meant no or if she was just nervous. I stared at her. "You let her walk out of here with everything. In cash." Her face flushed slightly. "We can't legally prevent a client from accessing their own funds if they're mentally competent." Mentally competent. That phrase felt clinical, detached. But competence doesn't mean safety, and fear doesn't always scream, it whispers. "I need to see the security footage," I said. Mrs. Henderson hesitated. "There are protocols?" "I'm filing a formal review," I interrupted gently but firmly. "Not to blame your branch, but because I believe my mother may have been under duress." The word hung in the air. Duress. Something shifted in her expression then. Concern replaced defensiveness. "I'll speak to security," she said quietly. I stepped outside and called my husband, Mark. He works in corporate security, nothing dramatic, just compliance investigations, but he understands systems. He understands how bureaucracy slows things down. "I need you here," I told him. 20 minutes later, he walked through those same glass doors, calm and focused. He greeted Mrs. Henderson politely, reviewed my executor documents, and spoke with the head of security in a tone that was respectful but unmistakably firm. We were escorted to a small back room, lined with monitors and servers humming softly. A technician pulled up footage from the date and time of the withdrawal. The screen flickered to life. Rear parking lot. The timestamp glowed in the corner. Then I saw it. A red sports car pulled into the employee lot. Sleek, expensive, familiar. My breath caught. The passenger door remained closed while the driver's side opened. A woman stepped out, heels clicking against asphalt. Even from the grainy black and white footage, I recognized her posture. Gretchen. She walked around the car, not toward the bank entrance, but toward the rear exit. Moments later, the door opened. My mother appeared. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile, slightly hunched, and she was alone. No one escorted her. She stepped out carefully, clutching a thick envelope to her chest. Then Gretchen moved, not gently, not lovingly. She grabbed our mother's upper arm and steered her toward the car. The grip was firm, possessive. My mother stumbled slightly, trying to keep pace. I felt something inside me crack. "She didn't even help her," I whispered. On the screen, Gretchen reached for the envelope. My mother resisted for a split second, barely perceptible, but enough. Then the envelope was gone. Snatched. My mother swayed backward. For a terrifying second, I thought she might fall. Gretchen didn't catch her. She tossed the envelope into the car, climbed into the driver's seat, and rolled down the window halfway. A crumpled piece of paper flew out, striking my mother's chest before drifting downward. The car sped away, leaving her standing alone in the lot. No ride, no support, just a piece of paper in her shaking hands. The room around me felt distant, like I was underwater. Mark leaned forward, jaw tight. "That's not a misunderstanding," he said quietly. "That's coercion." Coercion. The word echoed. I pressed my hand against the edge of the desk to steady myself. My mother had not made a spontaneous financial decision. She had been escorted, controlled, intimidated, and whatever was written on that piece of paper had been powerful enough to make her surrender everything. As the footage ended, the screen froze on the final frame, my mother alone in the parking lot, staring down at the paper in her hand. I didn't cry. Not then. Because grief was beginning to transform into something sharper, clarity. If Gretchen had nothing to hide, she wouldn't need to stand that close. If it were voluntary, she wouldn't need sunglasses indoors. And if it were innocent, she wouldn't have left our mother stranded like that. I turned to Mark slowly. "That paper," I said. "We need to find it." Because whatever was written on that page wasn't just an explanation. It was the key to everything. That night, I couldn't sit still. The image of my mother standing alone in that parking lot replayed over and over in my mind, the way her shoulders curved inward, the way she clutched that crumpled paper as if it were both a threat and a lifeline. I knew, with a certainty that made my chest ache, that whatever was written on that page had been powerful enough to override 20 years of discipline and caution. And if it had the power to make my mother empty her entire savings account, it had the power to destroy something much bigger. Mark and I went back to the house just after sunset. The air inside felt different now, not just heavy with grief, but charged, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. "We saw her holding that paper," Mark said quietly as he rolled up his sleeves. "She wouldn't have thrown it away." "No," I agreed. Mom never threw away anything important. We started in her bedroom again, but this time we weren't careful. We moved the nightstands, pulled open every drawer, checked between mattress layers, inside pillowcases, behind framed photos. I even ran my fingers along the inside hems of her coats hanging in the closet. Nothing. Hours passed. My knees ached from kneeling on hardwood floors. My hands were coated in dust. The house, once warm with memory, now felt like a maze, hiding answers on purpose. Think like her, Mark said gently. If she was scared, where would she hide something she didn't want anyone to find? That stopped me. My mother had always been private when it came to anything that worried her. When Dad got sick years ago, she kept his diagnosis folded inside a cookbook on the highest shelf. When she once thought she had misplaced a bill, she tucked the replacement copy inside a sewing kit because no one ever looks there. She hid fear in ordinary places. I dropped to my knees beside her bed and looked underneath it, really looked this time, not just a glance. Mark lay flat on the floor and reached as far back as he could. "There's something here," he muttered. He pulled out a small metal box, rust creeping along its corners. It was sealed with thick layers of old industrial tape, as if someone had wanted to make sure it stayed closed. My heart began pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. "That wasn't here before," I whispered. We carried it onto the bed. My fingers trembled as I took a small pocket knife from the drawer and carefully sliced through the tape. Each layer peeled back with a dry ripping sound that felt too loud in the quiet room. Inside the box were old receipts, medical bills, grocery slips, random papers from years ago. And then, sitting on top of them, slightly wrinkled but unmistakable, was the piece of paper. The same size, the same fold pattern we had seen on the security footage. I picked it up carefully, smoothing it against the quilt. The letterhead at the top made my stomach drop. It belonged to the corporate firm where both Gretchen and I had worked just over a year ago. I recognized it instantly. My hands went cold. The document looked official, formatted like an internal investigation report, bold header, formal language, case reference number. It stated that an internal audit had uncovered significant financial discrepancies within the regional accounting department. And then I saw my name. Primary suspect, Heidi Thompson. The words blurred for a moment. I read further. The report claimed I had engaged in unauthorized transfers, misallocation of company funds, and intentional manipulation of ledger entries to conceal embezzlement. It was detailed, specific, convincing, except it was completely false. I remembered that period vividly. There had been whispers of missing funds, yes. Gretchen had been the senior regional manager at the time. I had worked under her supervision as a junior accountant. When I asked about the discrepancies, she told me it was a software glitch tied to the new financial system. She assured me she would handle it. And I believed her. The document in my hands reframed everything. This wasn't a real investigative report. It was a fabrication. A weapon. "She told Mom you were under investigation," Mark said quietly, reading over my shoulder. I nodded slowly, the realization settling like ice in my veins. Gretchen must have convinced her that I was about to face criminal charges, that federal investigators were preparing to arrest me. That repayment of the missing funds quietly, discreetly, could make the problem disappear before it became public. My mother would have believed it. Of course she would have. Gretchen was successful, polished, authoritative. She spoke in confident tones and wore the right suits, and carried herself like someone who understood systems. And my mother trusted her children, especially when she thought one of them was in danger. "She spent a year thinking you were a criminal," Mark said softly. That was the part that broke something inside me. Not the money, not the lie. The thought that my mother had carried that fear alone. That every Friday deposit wasn't just savings for retirement, but a silent attempt to repay a debt she believed I owed. 20 years of discipline. 1 year of terror, and in the final month, perhaps Gretchen told her the investigation was escalating, that authorities needed a final lump sum payment to close the case permanently, that if she didn't act immediately, I would be arrested. I imagined my mother sitting at this very bed, reading this paper under the lamplight, her hands shaking, believing she was protecting me. I pressed my fingers to my lips, trying to steady my breathing. "She weaponized your reputation," Mark said quietly. "She used your integrity against her. And worse, she used a mother's love." I flipped the page over. There were subtle inconsistencies, formatting errors, slight misalignments in the margins. To anyone without accounting experience, it looked legitimate. But to me, the structure of the allegations didn't align with real internal compliance language. It was convincing but not authentic. "She forged this," I whispered. Mark's jaw tightened. "Then she's not just manipulative. She's criminal." For the first time since the funeral, my grief shifted fully into clarity. This was no longer a vague suspicion. It was calculated fraud. Gretchen hadn't just pressured our mother into withdrawing her savings. She had orchestrated a false narrative, destroyed my professional reputation in our mother's eyes, and exploited her fear to extract money. And if she was willing to fabricate corporate documents to do that, what else was she hiding? I looked back at the header of the fake report and remembered something else. The HR manager at the time, Fred, he had been abruptly terminated not long after the software glitch explanation. At the time, Gretchen told me it was restructuring. Now, that felt unlikely. If there was an actual financial discrepancy, I said slowly, someone would have investigated it properly. Mark nodded, and someone might have kept records. For the first time that night, a thin thread of resolve cut through my shock. My sister thought she had erased the truth. She thought she had silenced anyone who might question her. But lies leave footprints. And as an accountant, I had built my career on finding discrepancies hidden in plain sight. I folded the forged report carefully and placed it back in the metal box. "This isn't about the house anymore," I said quietly. It wasn't about inheritance. It wasn't about selling property. It was about clearing my name. It was about proving that my mother had been deceived. And it was about ensuring that the person who manipulated her fear never had the chance to do it again. As I turned off the bedroom light that night, the house no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a witness. And for the first time since the rain fell over her grave, I wasn't just grieving. I was preparing. The next morning, I drove to the far side of the city with the forged report resting on the passenger seat beside me like a silent accusation. I hadn't slept more than an hour, but exhaustion had sharpened my focus rather than dulled it. Grief had turned into something steadier, now determination. The apartment complex where Fred lived was nothing like the corporate offices we once worked in. Peeling paint clung to the exterior walls. Several windows were cracked, covered in mismatched blinds. The parking lot was uneven, scattered with oil stains and faded lines that hadn't been repainted in years. I sat in my car for a moment before stepping out, steadying myself. I wasn't just visiting a former HR manager. I was about to knock on the door of a man my sister had publicly humiliated and fired. A man who might hate anything connected to her, including me. Apartment 4B. I knocked once. No answer. Twice. On the third knock, I heard slow footsteps. The door opened a few inches. Chain still latched. Bloodshot eyes stared back at me before recognition flickered. "Heidi?" His voice was rough, unused to conversation this early in the morning. "Fred," I said quietly, "I'm sorry to show up unannounced." He stared at me for a long moment, then closed the door to remove the chain and opened it fully. He looked older than I remembered, not by years, but by wear. The kind of aging that comes from stress and bitterness settling deep into the bones. "I suppose you're not here on behalf of your sister," he muttered. "No," I replied. "I'm here because of her." He stepped aside without another word. The apartment smelled faintly of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Empty bottles were scattered near the kitchen sink. Unopened mail formed a small stack on the table. It wasn't chaos, but it wasn't stability either. "I lost everything because of her," Fred said flatly as he poured himself a cup of coffee that looked far too dark. "Career, reputation, severance. She called it restructuring." "I know," I said softly. He turned to face me. "Do you?" I reached into my bag and carefully removed the forged investigation report. I placed it on the coffee table between us. "She used this to convince my mother I had embezzled company funds," I said. "She made her believe I was under investigation. That repayment would make it disappear." Fred picked up the paper. His expression changed almost instantly. Not shock. Recognition. A dry, humorless laugh escaped him. "Of course she did. You've seen something like this before," I said. "She fabricated the narrative early," he replied, scanning the document. "When I started reviewing payroll anomalies and discretionary bonus transfers, she panicked. I told her there were inconsistencies that didn't align with the new accounting software's logs. My heart pounded. What inconsistencies? She was moving company funds into speculative stock positions, high risk, high volatility trades, trying to recover losses from something else, I suspect. He looked up at me. Gambling doesn't always happen in casinos. The pieces began locking into place. She blamed a software glitch, I whispered. Of course she did, Fred said again. And she needed someone beneath her to absorb scrutiny if headquarters asked questions. Me. She couldn't scapegoat you publicly, I said slowly. It would trigger formal audits. So she created an internal draft narrative instead, Fred finished. Something unofficial, something she could weaponize privately. Against our mother, Fred leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. She fired me because I wouldn't stop asking questions. No severance. Immediate termination. Claimed I was resistant to organizational restructuring. And were you? I was resistant to fraud. Silence settled between us. Did corporate ever investigate further? I asked. He shook his head. She manipulated the IT logs before escalation, claimed data corruption. Headquarters accepted it. The case died. But you suspected more. I knew, he corrected quietly. He stood and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room. From the bottom drawer, he pulled out an external hard drive. She underestimated one thing, he said, holding it up. Me. I felt my breath catch. I made copies of the transaction logs before my access was revoked, he continued. Time-stamped. Archived. Every irregular transfer she initiated. The room seemed to tilt slightly. You still have them? I have everything. He placed the hard drive on the table between us. Why didn't you go to authorities? I asked gently. Fred's jaw tightened, because without official internal acknowledgement, I'd look like a disgruntled employee. And I didn't have the resources to fight a corporation with a polished executive backing her version. He looked directly at me. But this changes things. I nodded slowly. She didn't just cover up corporate fraud. She coerced my mother into emptying her life savings by convincing her I was a criminal. That sobered him immediately. She what? I told him about the bank footage, the parking lot, the envelope, the forged document. As I spoke, the bitterness in his expression shifted into something darker. She used your mother, he said quietly, to plug her financial hole. Yes. He ran a hand over his face. She ruined my life to protect herself, and she destroyed your mother to finance it. The weight of that sentence hung heavy in the air. Fred, I said carefully, I'm not here for revenge. He raised an eyebrow. I'm here for truth, I continued. My mother died believing I was a thief. I need to clear that. And if Gretchen committed financial crimes, corporate or otherwise, she needs to answer for them. He studied me for a long moment. And if I give you this, he asked, tapping the hard drive. Then we go through legal channels, I replied, properly. Evidence, statements, transparency, no theatrics, just facts. I meant that. But as I left his apartment an hour later, hard drive secured in my bag and a recorded sworn statement saved to my phone, I knew something else too. Facts can be theatrical on their own, and Gretchen had no idea that the foundation beneath her was beginning to crack. That evening, I called her. I kept my voice small, tired. You were right, I said. I can't handle this house alone. Let's meet this weekend. I'll sign whatever we need to sign. The silence on the other end was brief, but I heard the satisfaction beneath it. I knew you'd come around, she said smoothly. I'll bring my attorney. Of course she would. After I hung up, I looked at Mark. She believes she's already won, I said quietly. Mark gave a faint, knowing smile. That's when people make mistakes. I placed the hard drive on the kitchen table. This wasn't about anger anymore. It wasn't even about the money. It was about exposing a pattern, one that stretched from corporate ledgers to a frightened woman in a bank lobby. And for the first time since I found that red notebook, I felt something steady replace the ache in my chest. Not vengeance, not hatred, resolve. Gretchen had built her life on control, but she forgot something fundamental. Every lie leaves a record, and I was very, very good at reading them. Saturday evening arrived with an eerie kind of calm. The house was spotless. Not because I was preparing to sell it, but because I needed everything to feel deliberate, controlled. The dining table had been cleared, except for a thick folder placed neatly at the center. From a distance, it looked official, heavy, convincing. Inside were harmless documents, old tax returns, insurance summaries, anything that would resemble paperwork to someone too eager to read carefully. Mark stood quietly in the living room, adjusting the small recording device we had set discreetly beneath a shelf. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. We both understood that this moment wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth being placed exactly where it belonged on the record. At precisely 7 o'clock, headlights washed across the front window, right on time. Gretchen stepped out of her red sports car wearing a tailored navy suit, hair sleek, posture confident. She moved like someone closing a deal she had already calculated in her favor. A tall man followed her up the walkway mid-50s, crisp gray suit, leather briefcase. "This is Mr. Sterling," she said when they entered. "My attorney." He nodded politely. Professional, detached. I returned the nod and gestured toward the dining table. "Thank you for coming." My voice was soft, controlled. I let my shoulders curve inward slightly, as if exhaustion had finally defeated me. They sat down. Gretchen placed her handbag carefully beside her chair and glanced around the house one last time. There was no nostalgia in her expression, only impatience. "Let's proceed," she said smoothly. Mr. Sterling opened his briefcase and removed a stack of formal documents, property transfer drafts, legal disclaimers, signature tabs marked with small yellow flags. Everything looked legitimate. I slid my own thick folder across the table toward her. "These are the documents I gathered," I said quietly. "I've organized everything." She didn't bother examining the cover. She flipped it open with confident speed, scanning the first few pages just enough to satisfy herself that there were papers inside. Her gold fountain pen appeared from her purse like a ceremonial object. She uncapped it slowly. For a brief moment, the only sound in the room was the soft scratch of paper shifting under her hands. And then I sat up straighter. Mark, standing near the wall behind her, met my eyes. I gave him a small nod. He pressed the remote. The television mounted above the fireplace flickered to life. The sudden glow of the screen reflected across the dining room walls, interrupting the calm like a crack in glass. Gretchen froze. On the screen, the grainy black and white footage of the bank's rear parking lot appeared. The timestamp glowed in the corner. Her pen hovered midair. The red sports car pulled into frame. "Mr." Sterling turned slowly toward the television. Gretchen's posture stiffened. "What is this?" Neither Mark nor I answered. The footage continued. My mother exiting the rear door. The envelope clutched tightly to her chest. The grip on her arm. The forceful movement toward the car. Mr. Sterling's face lost color. "That video is misleading," Gretchen snapped quickly, rising halfway from her seat. "Context matters." The screen didn't argue. It simply showed her snatching the envelope. Showed my mother stumbling. Showed the car leaving her behind. Silence filled the room, except for the faint hum of the television. Then the audio shifted. Fred's recorded voice filled the space, calm, steady, undeniable. He detailed the unauthorized transfers, the speculative investments, the manipulation of internal logs, the fabricated software glitch. He described the false report created to shift blame. He named Gretchen directly. Each word was measured, clear, professional. Gretchen's hand trembled slightly before she dropped the pen onto the table. "This is absurd," she hissed. "You're trying to frame me." I stood up slowly. "I'm not framing you," I said quietly. "I'm finishing the story you started." She lunged across the table, rage finally cracking through the polished surface she'd worn for years. Mark moved instantly, stepping between us and restraining her wrists with firm, controlled precision. Not violent, just enough to stop her from advancing. "Let go of me," she screamed. The front door opened. Sheriff Miller stepped inside with calm authority, accompanied by another officer. They had been waiting outside, listening to everything through the open kitchen window as planned. Mr. Sterling stood abruptly, raising his hands slightly as if distancing himself from the situation. "Miss Thompson," Sheriff Miller said evenly, You are under arrest on suspicion of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and corporate fraud. You have the right to remain silent." The words were steady, procedural. Gretchen's anger shifted into something else: shock. "This is ridiculous," she insisted, though her voice no longer carried certainty. "You can't prove anything." Sheriff Miller glanced briefly at the television, still paused on the parking lot image. "Evidence has been reviewed," he replied. As they secured her wrists with handcuffs, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just stillness. The room, which had carried so much tension for weeks, suddenly felt quiet. She was escorted outside, past the same front door she had stormed through after threatening legal action. This time, she didn't look back. The legal proceedings moved forward in the weeks that followed. Fred's archived transaction logs were verified by forensic accountants. Digital timestamps matched internal systems. The fabricated report's formatting inconsistencies were confirmed by compliance experts. The bank footage corroborated coercion. It wasn't dramatic in a cinematic sense. It was methodical. Piece by piece, the narrative she had constructed collapsed under documentation. In court, she no longer looked invincible. She looked small. The judge emphasized the severity of exploiting an elderly parent's trust for financial gain. Corporate misconduct added weight. The sentence reflected both. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse feeling neither victorious nor defeated, just lighter. The house in Birmingham remained for a while longer. I walked through each room slowly before listing it for sale, not because Gretchen had wanted it sold, but because I realized something important. The house held memories of warmth, but it also held echoes of fear. And I didn't want to build my future inside walls that had witnessed silent suffering. The funds recovered through asset seizure were substantial. I didn't keep them. Instead, I established the Clara Memorial Fund, dedicated to assisting elderly individuals facing financial exploitation, legal guidance, educational outreach, small grants for those trapped in situations they didn't know how to navigate. It felt right. Mark and I used our own savings to purchase a modest recreational vehicle, something my mother had once circled in a travel magazine, laughing about one day seeing the national parks. We packed lightly. When we left Birmingham, the sky was clear. No rain this time. I visited my mother's grave one last time before we departed. "I cleared it," I whispered softly. "You were protecting me. But I didn't need protection. I needed truth." The wind moved gently through the trees. For the first time since the funeral, I felt peace settle in my chest. I learned something through all of this. Blind loyalty can be dangerous. Silence can protect the wrong person. And love, when manipulated, can become a weapon. But truth, steady, patient truth, has a way of resurfacing, even when buried. As Mark started the engine and the road stretched out ahead of us, I didn't look back. Not because the past didn't matter, but because it no longer owned me. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize this story was never just about money, inheritance, or even betrayal. It was about how easily love can be manipulated when fear is introduced. My mother wasn't weak. She wasn't foolish. She was a mother who believed she was protecting her child, and that belief was weaponized against her. That's what makes this story so painful and so important. Financial abuse doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it hides behind polished smiles, professional titles, and the illusion of success. Sometimes it happens quietly inside families, where trust is assumed and questions feel disloyal. If this story taught me anything, it's that instincts matter. Silence has consequences. And truth, no matter how buried, deserves to surface. If this story resonated with you, if it made you reflect on trust, family, or the quiet signs we often ignore, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Revenge Tales Society for more stories about resilience, justice, and the complicated bonds that shape our lives. Your support allows these stories to be told, and sometimes hearing the truth is the first step toward protecting someone you love.